and welcome to day 3 of the conference. I'm so excited to be here and to introduce our keynote speaker. She is a leading scholar, literary critic, and biographer. Dr. Holly Ordway is an award-winning author of Tolkien Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond Middle Ages. Her most recent book is Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography. Today, she'll discuss how one of C.S. Lewis' most enduring legacies through the perspective of his close friend and fellow author, J.R.R. Tolkien. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Holly Ordway.
Good. Well, hello and good morning and welcome. It is really lovely to be here amongst friends, very congenial environment. And so here we are going to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, two towering giants of fantasy literature. Now, C.S. Lewis greatly admired Middle-earth. He declared that The Lord of the Rings is like lightning from a clear sky. Nothing quite like it was ever done before. What did Tolkien think about Narnia? Well, we heard a perspective on that last night in our evening performance, but let's continue to check in with popular wisdom. So here's a page from some Doctor Who fan fiction, Crossing of the Streams, where we find that Tolkien is an old misery gut with his complaints about Narnia. Now, there are loads of memes about this, most of them so rude I couldn't put in my PowerPoint. Now, this view would appear to be well-grounded. After all, Tolkien's official biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, said that Tolkien's view was to totally reject the Narnia stories. And according to George Sayer, Tolkien called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe almost worthless and about as bad as can be. Other biographers concur. A.N. Wilson says that Tolkien hated The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Philip and Carol Zaleski described Tolkien's reaction to the first Narnia chronicle as apoplectic. So from A to Z, we seem to have a consensus. Lewis loved Middle-earth, describing The Lord of the Rings as glorious, immensely worth reading, the book we have all been waiting for. On the other hand, Tolkien hated Narnia and the horse it rode in on. But is that, in fact, the case? No. Late in his life, Tolkien wrote to a friend that the Narnia stories are deservedly very popular. Not just that they were popular, a statement of fact, but that they are deservedly so. We'll come back to that. But for now, it's just worth noting that these are not the words of a man who believes that the Narnia books are almost worthless. What did Tolkien really think about Narnia? This isn't just about one man's opinion of a particular book. Getting it right, understanding what Tolkien really thought about Narnia and why, and figuring out how we got it wrong matters for our understanding of Tolkien's personality, his taste, his literary judgment, and of the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien. So let's begin at the beginning with some detective work. First, let's set the stage. Lewis began working on the story that would become the first volume of the Narnia Chronicles in late 1948. At that point, Lewis had published the 3 volumes of the Ransom trilogy, but this was his first foray into children's fiction. Tolkien had published The Hobbit a decade before the beginning of these Narnia stories, in 1937. It was reviewed positively, it was nominated for the Carnegie Medal, and it was such a strong seller that Tolkien's publisher immediately asked him for a sequel. And he finally completed the manuscript of that sequel, The Lord of the Rings, in the fall of 1949. So by 1949, Lewis had published more, but Tolkien had more experience as a writer of children's literature. The Inklings were slowing down, and in fact, the very last Thursday gathering took place in October of that year, October 1949. As a result, none of the Narnia Chronicles were read at an Inklings meeting. So if Lewis wanted Tolkien's opinion, he had to ask him privately, which is what he did. Tolkien's initial exposure to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe took place in early 1949 when Lewis read 2 draft chapters to him in a private meeting. We know this from Roger Lancelyn Green, who visited Lewis at Magdalen College, Oxford, on March 10, 1949, and noted in his diary afterwards a few details from that meeting. He and Lewis had a wonderful talk until midnight. He read me 2 chapters of a story for children he is writing. Very good indeed, though a trifle self-conscious. According to Green, Lewis had read these chapters of Tolkien not long before their meeting. This diary entry is the full extent of the information from contemporary records about Tolkien's first encounter with Narnia. That's it. There's no mention of Lewis meeting with Tolkien to read him the first chapters of Narnia, or of Tolkien's reaction in Lewis's entire collected letters, or in Tolkien's published letters, or in any of Tolkien's unpublished letters that I've had the opportunity to see. Green's diary entry is it. And as we can see, there's almost nothing to note, except for one key fact. Only the first couple chapters of The Lion existed at this point. The next extant reference to Tolkien's reaction comes 14 years later, again from Roger Lancelyn Green, in his 1963 monograph, C.S. Lewis. This little book, only 61 pages long, is extremely obscure. CBB probably has a copy. And it's very valuable for our purposes. Green explains that of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, only a little had been written down, but then set aside owing to the criticism from one of his older friends, that is Tolkien, by then rather out of touch with children and their books and wedded to different modes of thought where fairy tale and fantasy were concerned. However, the story was not to be kept down. By March 1949, he was working on it again and reading the early chapters to another friend who proved more encouraging and perhaps saw more clearly that here was the beginning of a really new and exciting development in children's literature. Green's attention to accuracy is apparent. Lewis has told him that he showed it to Tolkien, but Green doesn't know when that meeting happened, so he doesn't say. But he does know exactly when Lewis started working the story again. It's by March of 1949, because that's when he heard the first chapters. The more encouraging friend in this account was, of course, Green himself. And his commentary on the older friend indicates, I think, a little touch of Green's protectiveness towards Lewis. Tolkien was, in fact, much more in touch with children and their reading than the childless Lewis. But I suspect that Green was proud to be the newer, younger friend who had the insight to properly appreciate Narnia. This account gives no indication that Tolkien had a particularly negative reaction to The Lion. Critical, yes. But Lewis didn't like butter baths, and setting aside the story for a time is a reasonable reaction to a critique. This account of Tolkien's reaction to Narnia is the last to be published while Lewis and Tolkien were still alive. For the next account of this conversation, we jump forward another 11 years to a 1974 article, once again by Green. You can tell we've entered the 70s. And this is the first time that we have any reported dialogue from Lewis. According to Green, Lewis read him the first 2 chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then stopped suddenly and said, "Do you think it's worth going on with?" When Green assured him that it was, Lewis continued, "I started it some time ago," said Lewis, "but it didn't work. There was no Aslan in it then. But just recently I saw how it ought to go, so I began again, and I can see it clearly right to the end. So I wrote these 2 chapters. But Tolkien doesn't like them. What do you really think? Lewis describes Tolkien's reaction in a straightforward and calm manner. He doesn't like them. The reference to not liking them is consistent with the account thus far, that Tolkien had heard only the first 2 chapters of The Lion, not the whole of The Lion, let alone the entire Narnian septet. Green then pointed out how natural it was that Tolkien should not like it, for his fantasy world, the world of the Hobbit, was so very different, with a different greatness. As different, I think I said, as the princess in Curdie was from the wind in the willows. Evidently, Green did not think that Tolkien's reaction was excessive or unreasonable. Notice also how Green indicates if he's unsure of even a minor detail. I think I said, for his recollection of the contrasting examples. It's another example, another indication of his reliability. We find a slightly expanded version of this story in the 1974 biography of Lewis that Green co-authored with Walter Hooper. Presumably this is based on Green's recollections, since Hooper hadn't met Lewis or Tolkien at this time when Narnia was composed, and there's no indication that Hooper spoke with Lewis about it later in this presentation of the story. On 10 March 1949, Green dined with Lewis and Maudlin, and thereafter followed a wonderful talk until midnight. He read me 2 chapters of a story he is writing. Lewis stopped reading with a remark that he had read the story to Tolkien, who had disliked it intensely. Was it any good? Here we have the first shift in the way the story is reported. The strength of Tolkien's reaction increases slightly to disliked it intensely. And the phrase disliked it now implies that Tolkien had heard the whole story, which does not seem to have been the case. This 1974 account is also the first time that we get any reported direct speech from Tolkien. Tolkien met Green shortly thereafter and remarked, "I hear you've been reading Jack's children's story. It really won't do, you know. I mean, to say nymphs and their ways, the love life of a faun, doesn't he know what he's talking about?" This is an important piece of evidence. To be sure, it's 25 years after the fact, but Green is recalling something that Tolkien said to him, and as Green kept a diary, he was probably in the habit of paying attention. Tolkien's remark is specific to the first few chapters of the story, which is consistent with what was established in the earlier accounts. These remarks have often been quoted as if they were a dismissal of the whole of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or even the whole of Narnia. So it's worth attending closely to the context here. Let's zero in on the specific scene that Tolkien refers to. Mr. Tumnus, the faun, has brought Lucy to his house for tea. In one corner, there was a door which Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on one wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at these while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Silenus, or Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks, and Gamekeepers, a Study in Popular Legend, or Is Man a Myth? What was it that Tolkien felt won't do? I think that the key point here is that in classical mythology, fauns or satyrs are lustful figures who are, to put it bluntly, rapists. And with that in mind, we can observe some potentially jarring notes. One is the door that Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom. The child reader will not think twice, but the adult reader of classics might well do so. Then there are the book titles. The Life and Letters of Silenus. Silenus is the drunken satyr who's the foster father to Bacchus. Nymphs and Their Ways. Well, nymphs are nubile female nature spirits who are pursued by lustful and drunken fauns and satyrs. Now, I don't think that Lewis intended any hint of sexual innuendo. Lewis knew as well as Tolkien how lecherous fawns are in classical literature, but we can see that Mr. Tumnus, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is a respectable bachelor fawn, and he repents of the very intention of kidnapping Lucy. We, as readers, also have the benefit of the illustrations for The Lion, which illustrate the scene and they reinforce the innocence of it. And in the context of the last two book titles, Nymphs and Their Ways is evidently a work of natural history. But let's put ourselves back in the moment. Envision Tolkien hearing these chapters for the first time. Once that classical myth train of associations got started, Tolkien might have just thought it was a bit much. What kind of stuff was Jack thinking was appropriate for children? So when he makes this remark to Green, and remember, he has heard only the first two chapters. When he makes this remark to Green, I suspect that he was mocking Lewis's use of the fawn character, and that he invents another book title, The Love Life of a Fawn, for comic effect. It really won't do, to say Nymphs in Their Ways, the love life of a fawn. Doesn't he know what he's talking about? Now, this is absolutely consistent with Tolkien's hyperbolic communication style. Rather than saying very earnestly, Green, I'm not sure that Jack has got quite the appropriate tone for children's literature here. He uses sarcasm delivered with his characteristic exaggeration for effect. This element of hyperbole and verbal aggression was prominent in Tolkien's conversational style. It's easily misunderstood when it's reduced to cold print, but it seems to have been taken in stride by his friends. For instance, Owen Barfield recalled an encounter at which Tolkien was in a ridiculously combative mood and seemed to me to contradict nearly everything I said. Nonetheless, Barfield recalled their conversation was entirely good-humored and enjoyable. George Sayre observed that in conversation with the Lewis brothers, Tolkien might burst into savage, scathing criticism. Then he might soon become genial again. And Sayre felt that there was an element of acting about this gesturing, even in a serious conversation. So on the page, Tolkien's remark can be read as a harsh put-down. It really won't do, Doesn't he know what he's talking about? But Green and Hooper, who knew him well, understood that these outbursts were part of his personality. And they take his remark as a criticism, but they don't make much of it. And if it ever got back to Lewis, he seems to have been basically unbothered. So far, our accounts of Tolkien's first encounter with Narnia all trace back to Roger Lancel and Green. And he seems to have been a responsible and reliable biographer. Over the course of 4 different accounts in 25 years, he does not change his tune. We have little detail about Tolkien's initial reaction to Narnia, which makes sense, given that 3 out of the 4 accounts are third-hand and 1 is second-hand. In all 4 accounts, the story is reported consistently. Tolkien heard the first few chapters and didn't like what he heard, but nobody, including Lewis, seemed to have been particularly worked up about it. Our next stop is 1977 and the publication of Humphrey Carpenter's J.R.R. Tolkien, a Biography, followed 1 year later by Carpenter's group biography of the Inklings. It's now 28 years since Lewis read the first chapters of The Lion to Tolkien. Lewis has been dead for 14 years. Tolkien has been dead for 4 years. So far, the various accounts of Tolkien's reaction to Narnia have given us a fairly ordinary picture of 2 literary friends with different tastes. But Carpenter gives us a very different perspective in these 2 biographies. In his biography of Tolkien, Carpenter gives the core of the story as follows. In 1949, Lewis began to read the first of them, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, aloud to Tolkien. It was received with a snort of contempt. "It really won't do," Tolkien told Roger Lancelin Green. "I mean to say, nymphs in their ways, the love life of a faun." Having seen Green's account, we can recognize that this snort of contempt is Carpenter's interpolation into the story. Carpenter goes on to say that Tolkien disliked Narnia, indeed disliked it so much that it affected his friendship with Lewis. We will return to that point in a little bit. Just 1 year later, Carpenter published his group biography of the Inklings. Here is his account in that volume. Why, then, did he totally reject the Narnia stories? For reject them he did. Lewis told his former pupil Roger Lancelin Green, who sometimes drank with the Inklings at the Bird and Baby, that after listening to the opening chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Tolkien had said he disliked it intensely. And when Green met Tolkien shortly afterwards, Tolkien said to him, "I hear you've been reading Jack's children's story. It really won't do, you know." The tale has grown in the telling. Carpenter now asserts that Tolkien's reaction was to totally reject the Narnia books, all of them. The earlier accounts give no indication that this was the case even for the first of the books. How does Carpenter support this claim? First, Carpenter quotes from Green and Hooper in such a way as to make it appear that disliked it intensely is Tolkien's own words. But these are the words that Green used in paraphrasing Lewis's description of Tolkien's reaction. And Carpenter knew that because he indicates that the Green and Hooper biography is his source. He also drops the context of "it won't do," which is to say, I mean to say, nymphs in their way is the love life of a faun, which he had included in the earlier account. Now, in isolation, Tolkien's "it won't do" seems to refer to the whole of The Lion, and by implication, to the whole of the Narnia series. Carpenter reinforces this by wrapping up his account with a statement that for Tolkien, it just wouldn't do, and he turned his back on it. What's even more significant is how Carpenter shapes the context to provide an interpretive frame for Tolkien's reaction to Narnia. In both his biography of Tolkien and his group biography of the Inklings, Carpenter creates a dramatic narrative about Narnia as a source of conflict between Tolkien and Lewis, a contributing factor, or even the contributing factor, in what he calls, in the Inklings biography, the decay of their friendship. Now, the drifting apart between Tolkien and Lewis was a genuine phenomenon for which there were a number of legitimate reasons. Both men had busy professional lives. Tolkien had children and grandchildren, and after his marriage, Lewis had stepchildren. In 1954, Lewis began working in Cambridge during the week, and so the opportunities for meeting were significantly reduced. Tolkien himself gives a straightforward and consistent account of the strains in their friendship. For instance, in a letter to his son Michael, he wrote, "We were separated first by the sudden apparition of Charles Williams, and then by his marriage, of which he never even told me. I learned of it long after the event. But we owed each a great debt to the other, and that tie, with the deep affection that it begot, remains." Narnia doesn't even get a mention. But Narnia is the reason that Carpenter puts front and center in the biography. In part, the increasing coolness on Tolkien's side was probably due to his dislike of Lewis's Narnia stories for children. The passage in which Carpenter endeavors to explain Tolkien's dislike of Narnia has been so influential that it is worth considering in some detail. Let's go through the line of reasoning here. Carpenter says that undoubtedly he felt that Lewis had in some ways drawn on Tolkien's ideas and stories in the books. Undoubtedly. there's no evidence of Lewis borrowing Tolkien's ideas for Narnia, let alone Tolkien being bothered by it. Now, Tolkien was mildly irritated about Lewis using the name Numenor and misspelling it in his Handsome trilogy. I think that was probably what really irritated him. But that's not Narnia. Then Carpenter states that Tolkien resented Lewis's progress from convert to popular theologian as support for his next claim. But hold on, this is actually an assertion that is just an assertion. It is not borne out by the evidence. Then Carpenter says that Tolkien was perhaps irritated by the fact that the friend and critic who had listened to the tales of Middle-earth had, as it were, got up from his armchair, gone to the desk, picked up a pen, and had a go himself. He seems to be suggesting that Lewis had been inspired by hearing Tolkien's stories to give a try at children's fiction himself. I think this is a huge oversimplification of Lewis's creative process, but that's actually irrelevant. For years, Lewis and Tolkien had encouraged each other to write. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, which Tolkien admired greatly, came directly out of the so-called wager between the two men. Lewis had declared, "There is too little of what we really like in stories, and therefore we shall have to write some ourselves." He took on a space travel story, and Tolkien a time travel story. Since they were actively prompting each other to write stories, why would Tolkien be irritated by Lewis writing a new story? That, perhaps, is doing a lot of work here. Lastly, Carpenter states that the sheer number of Lewis's books for children and the almost indecent haste with which they are produced undoubtedly annoyed him, to the point that it became another wedge between the two friends. Undoubtedly, again. And that indecent haste is Carpenter's editorializing. This last claim, that Tolkien was jealous of Lewis's fluency, has been repeatedly picked up and reinforced by later biographers, so it's worth some additional consideration. Tolkien was well aware that Lewis, or indeed pretty much anybody, published at a faster rate than he did. When it came to finishing his Middle-earth legendarium, he worked, as Lewis remarked, at the rate of a coral insect. But Lewis had also published far more essays and book reviews by Tolkien, and had done for years. We would really need some evidence, which we don't have, that it was Narnia specifically that got on Tolkien's nerves, if indeed any of it got on Tolkien's nerves. But I want to point out something else. During the time that Lewis was working on the Narnia books, Tolkien was in fact publishing more than usual. His allegorical story, Leaf by Niggle, had, as he recalled, been written around 1939, very swiftly, one day when I awoke with it already in mind. He published it in 1945. Farmer Giles of Ham was published in late 1949, the year before the first Narnia Chronicle. His alliterative verse play, The Homecoming of Bjornhild's Son, was published in 1953, the same year as Lewis's The Silver Chair. In 1954 and 1955, the 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings finally made it into print, involving much labor and attention from Tolkien. Was Tolkien bothered by Lewis's speed of writing and publishing the Narnia books between 1951 and 1956? Possibly, but I wonder if he even noticed. Returning to Carpenter's detailed list of grievances, we can see that the cumulative effect is to render it plausible that Tolkien's dislike of Narnia was a core reason for the decay of their friendship. But consider our situation. We are reading Carpenter's telling, of Green's report, of Lewis's account, of Tolkien's reaction to Narnia in 1949. So we are getting increasingly distant from Tolkien's actual limited encounter with Narnia, but we're getting more detail, not less, about Tolkien's reactions and applying these reactions more widely. Now, A reasonable question would be, is Carpenter drawing on material in the Tolkien letters and family papers that only he has had access to? The answer to that is almost certainly not. He quotes Tolkien directly just once about his general reaction to Narnia. It is sad that Narnia and all that part of C.S.'s work should remain outside the range of my sympathy. That's all he's got. His only cited source for the Narnia section is Green and Hooper's biography of Lewis. When we compare Green's accounts and Green and Hooper's biography to Carpenter's presentation material, we can recognize that much of what appears in Carpenter's two biographies is actually interpretation or speculation. Now, it is necessary for a biographer to interpret the material, and it is legitimate for a biographer to speculate, but those interpretations and speculations should be supported by evidence. Carpenter does give some indication that he is speculating. The difficulty is that here we have so much speculation supported by so little or no evidence, a point that is easily missed in the flow of Carpenter's excellent prose. As a result, his assertions about Tolkien's state of mind, Tolkien's motives, his reactions, have been largely unquestioned and frequently taken by later biographers as simple facts. Carpenter was forthright about his willingness to be creative in his interpretation of biographical material. He remarked that in a biography, the principal agenda is always the personality of the biographer, and that having finished writing a biography, one could go back to the source material and write several completely different lives of the same person, which would be just as long and which use different material to tell a very different story. He also remarked that upsetting the loyal fans is one of my main aims. I've always explained this aggression to myself by saying that around each figure there's an absurd cult of admirers, people who want the great person to remain untarnished, and it's a challenge to try and tarnish them. Next on our timeline is George Sayer, whose two accounts of Tolkien's reaction to Narnia have been nearly as influential as Carpenter's. It's now 1988, 39 years after Tolkien first encountered Narnia. In his biography of C.S. Lewis, Sayer gives this account of Tolkien's response to The Lion. Lewis was hurt, astonished, and discouraged when Tolkien said that he thought the book was almost worthless and that it seemed like a jumble of unrelated mythologies. Tolkien never changed his view. He so strongly detested Jack's assembling figures from various mythologies in his children's books that he soon gave up trying to read them. He also thought that they were carelessly and superficially written. His condemnation was so severe that one suspects that he envied the speed with which Jack wrote and compared it with his own laborious method of composition. We now have it that Tolkien didn't merely dislike Lion, he found it to be almost worthless. Sayer also suggests that he's envious of Lewis's speed, an idea first stated by Carpenter. Sayer provides no footnote here, giving the impression that all of it comes from his own recollection, but if so, it's a markedly stronger version of the story than the one that was told much more contemporaneously by Green. Sayer's list of sources includes both Green and Hooper's biography and Carpenter's Inklings. And in fact, Sayer notes, I am grateful to Humphrey Carpenter for advice, and I have also derived much help from his splendid volume, The Inklings. In 1996, Sayer reflected again on Tolkien and Narnia. Lewis and Tolkien were separated also by the success of the Narnia stories, the first of which appeared when he was struggling to get The Lord of the Rings through the press. He described it to be about as bad as can be. It was written superficially and far too quickly. I think that perhaps he envied Lewis's fluency, had an obvious message, but above all was a mix-up of characters from dissimilar and incompatible imaginative worlds. Dr. Cornelius, Father Time, the White Witch, Father Christmas, and Dryads should not be included in the same story. We now have a new direct quote from Tolkien that the lion was about as bad as can be, but we have no context for this remark or indication of Tolkien's tone. There is independent evidence that Tolkien really did object to the obvious message and to the mix-up of characters, as we'll see in a moment, but not for the assertion that Tolkien felt that it was written superficially and far too quickly. This account is also the first time that Sayre says that Lewis and Tolkien were separated by the success of Narnia. In his 1988 biography, he didn't find it relevant even to mention their friendship cooling, let alone attribute it to Narnia. It's now 47 years after Tolkien first encountered Narnia, and 23 years after Tolkien's death. Rather than providing an independent confirmation of Carpenter's account, it looks as though Sayre has internalized Carpenter's interpretation for certain points that he no longer remembers very clearly. And I want to call your attention to another little detail that indicates the lack of clarity of Sayre's recollection. We saw earlier that he said that Tolkien soon gave up trying to read the Narnia books. This is often quoted as evidence that Tolkien didn't care for them. But here, in his description of Tolkien's objection, he says he objects to the characters: Dr. Cornelius, Prince Caspian; Father Time, Last Battle; the White Witch, Father Christmas, and Dryads. If Tolkien hadn't finished reading the Chronicles, how could he object to Father Time? So, from the 1990s onward, biographers have routinely recycled the accounts given by Carpenter and Sayre, and they have turned the volume up even more. For instance, we have A.N. Wilson's account. Tolkien hated The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He regarded it as scrappily put together and not in his sense of subcreation, that is, a coherently made imaginative world. But presumably, since he was only human, he also felt an element of resentment at Lewis's fluency, his ability to get a thing done, and his increasing attractiveness to publishers. What evidence is there for any of this? Wilson gives no footnote for this passage. In 2005, Alan Jacobs wrote in The Narnian that Tolkien thought that Lewis wrote too much and too quickly. The Narnia books appalled him, probably because of their promiscuous mixing of mythological elements. He gives no citation for these statements. In 2014, Raymond Edwards states in his biography, Tolkien, that Lewis read parts of the Narnia stories to Tolkien, who detested them. He deplored their eclecticism and what was to him the evident haste and carelessness of the writing. Tolkien said to a former pupil who'd also seen the stories, "It really won't do, you know." Edwards cites no sources here, and he extends Carpenter's application of "it really won't do" to all the Narnia stories. In 2015, Philip and Carol Zaleski describe Tolkien's reaction to the first Narnia Chronicles as apoplectic, another increase in volume. And they go on to say what really irked Tolkien about Narnia was that he saw Lewis as deploying for a pious allegory bits and pieces of classical and Tolkien-esque mythology, instead of undertaking the long labor required to create a fully realized mythological world. This passage lacks any cited sources. Wilson, Jacobs, Edwards, and the Zaleskis are useful examples because these are major biographies that include citations of sources for other claims throughout the books, just not for Tolkien's reaction to Narnia. We know that these authors consulted Carpenter's biographies because one or both of Carpenter's books appear in each of their bibliographies or elsewhere in their notes. Somehow, though, Carpenter's speculations and interpretive assertions have become so thoroughly assimilated that they are now routinely stated as fact and indeed as common knowledge, not even needing a citation. Qualifiers such as perhaps, probably, and I suspect have gradually dropped away. We've started with a calm observation from Roger Lancelyn Green that Lewis told him that Tolkien doesn't like the first two chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. we've ended with reports that Tolkien was apoplectic in his dislike of Narnia and that it contributed to the breakup of his friendship with Lewis. You know what really won't do? Yes, it really won't do to let this game of telephone misrepresent what Tolkien really thought about Narnia. So let's find out, what did Tolkien really think about Narnia? Now, the first point to make is that Tolkien probably didn't think much about Narnia at all. Today, the Narnia Chronicles are recognized as literary classics with a sophisticated structure and themes. So in hindsight, we expect Tolkien to have read them attentively, but that is an error of chronological perspective. It's not surprising that Roger Lancelyn Green, a budding writer himself, found it memorable to hear the draft of Lewis's story. There's no reason to think that it made a big impression on Tolkien, who was used to hearing works in progress from his friends, some better than others, some that were ever finished, some that were never finished. And so we have this account also, according to George Sayre, that Tolkien soon gave up trying to read them. That he gave up indicates that he made a start, at any rate, but that he soon gave up indicates that he didn't get very far. There was no obligation for him to keep reading something that he didn't enjoy. Now we can observe next that Tolkien simply didn't enjoy a certain kind of fantasy story. Green, who had many conversations with him on the subject, recalls that Tolkien confessed that he did not care much for made-up fairy stories of the Prince Prigio and E. Nesbit variety, or mine either, which tallies with his later outburst to me about C.S. Lewis's first Narnian story, which he and I had read in manuscript. It's refreshing to get back to Green, the contemporaneous reporter who provides some instructive literary comparisons. Prince Prigio is a fairy tale by Andrew Lang. Tolkien appreciated a scene in which the prince restores to life a group of brave knights who have been turned into stone. He says it's a piece of more serious fairy story fantasy than the main bulk of the story. However, Tolkien said that he found the work unsatisfactory because it has a half-mocking smile and is also given to preaching. Tolkien called Edith Nesbit an author I delight in, and declared that her tales, The Phoenix and the Carpet and the Story of the Amulet, demonstrate her triumphant formula. These stories take place in the real world, albeit one with fantastical creatures such as the wish-granting Samiad. She also wrote many short stories set in fairy tale kingdoms, and it's these that Tolkien seems not to have cared for. They do tend to be rather twee. For instance, in the magic world, we have The Magician's Heart, which opens thusly. We all have our weaknesses. Mine is mulberries, yours perhaps motor cars. Professor Taken's was christenings, royal christenings. He always expected to be asked to the christening parties of all the little royal babies. And of course he never was, because he was not a lord or a duke or a seller of bacon and tea or anything really high class, but merely a wicked magician who by economy and strict attention to customers had worked up a very good business of his own. Tolkien strongly disliked this kind of smirking over the head of the child reader, and he would have found at least some hints of it in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Roger Lancelyn Green noted in 1949 that there was an element of self-consciousness in the draft of The Lion, and at his suggestion, Lewis made some changes, such as eliminating the exclamation "crikey" on the grounds of it sounding too much like Nesbit. Tolkien also objected that Lewis was too obvious about the religious content of the stories. In 1966, Nan C.L. Scott and her husband visited Tolkien in Oxford. She recounts that he expressed distaste for Lewis's Narnia books because of their allegorical nature. That's the only remark about Narnia recorded in Scott's article, and it gives a specific reason for Tolkien's objection. Walter Hooper touches on the same point, and with much more context since he was friends with Tolkien for years. In his essay, Narnia, the Author, the Critics, and the Tale, Hooper carefully assesses the reception of the Narnia Chronicles, including any adverse reactions. His only report of Tolkien's reaction is this: Professor Tolkien once told me that he thought the Christian elements in the Narnian stories too obvious. Lewis does make the Christian element considerably more prominent in the Narnia books than it is, for instance, in Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra, both of which Tolkien enjoyed greatly. Whether it is too obvious is a matter of taste. Tolkien's own modus operandi was to make the religious element in his stories implicit rather than explicit, and it seems that he preferred that in his reading as well. In the Inklings biography, Carpenter says that Tolkien rejected Narnia because of Lewis's handling of the secondary world. Why wouldn't it do? Tolkien disliked works of the imagination that were written hastily, that were inconsistent in their details, and were not always totally convincing in their evocation of a secondary world. Every loose end, every detail of the story, the chronology, the geography, even the meteorology of Middle-earth had to be consistent and plausible so that the reader would, as Tolkien wished, take the book in a sense as history. The line in which the wardrobe offended against all these notions. Moreover, the story borrowed so indiscriminately from other mythologies and narratives that for Tolkien, the suspension of disbelief, the entering into a secondary world, was simply impossible. It just wouldn't do, and he turned his back on it. Carpenter is making a strong claim that Tolkien only enjoyed books that met his own standard of subcreative detail for his own Middle-earth. It's plausible, but is it entirely true? Tolkien certainly was obsessively attentive to detail in The Lord of the Rings, but the question is whether he made this a criteria for other authors' books. He appreciated consistency in a secondary world. For instance, he considered Andrew Lang's Prince Ricardo to be a muddle, jotting a note that its material cannot be arranged in geographical sequence or their histories chronologically arranged. But as we've seen, that's not the only reason why he didn't care for Lang's fairy stories, nor was it an absolute value. For instance, Tolkien loved Kenneth Grahame's The Wind in the Willows. Now, The Wind in the Willows is a great book, but a consistent and coherent secondary world it is not. Ratty, for instance, lives in a hole in the riverbank, but Mr. Toad lives in a country house and buys motor cars. Where does Mr. Toad get his money? What size is he that he can fit in Ratty's hole but also drive a human-sized car and get thrown into a human jail? Nevertheless, Tolkien praised it as an excellent book and a delightful picture. Furthermore, the composite nature of Wind of the Willows didn't bother Tolkien in the least. He describes Willows as a mix of beast fables, satire, comedy, conte de fées, or even pantomime, wild wood and rivers of Oxfordshire. But it was a mix he liked. He called it an almost perfect blend of many pigments. Let's turn now to George Sayers' biography. Setting aside the somewhat overheated version of Tolkien's overall reaction, we have some useful data. Tolkien said that he thought the book seemed like a jumble of unrelated mythologies because Aslan, the Fauns, the White Witch, Father Christmas, the Nymphs, and Mr. and Mrs. Beaver had quite distinct mythological or imaginative origins. Tolkien thought that it was a terrible mistake to put them together in Narnia, a single imaginative country. The effect was incongruous and for him painful. But Jack argued that they existed happily together in our minds in real life. Tolkien replied, "Not in mine, at least not at the same time." Tolkien is not issuing a blanket condemnation, but rather saying that for him, as a reader, the mix in the Lion doesn't work, or at least not in the way that Lewis has done it. Ironically, Tolkien shared the objection to Father Christmas with Roger Lancelot Green, who, despite liking everything else about the Lion, recalled reacting against the presence of Father Christmas and urging Lewis to omit him. Curiously, though, from 1920 to 1943, Tolkien created the Father Christmas letters for his children. It seems that Tolkien didn't have such a principled insistence on a perfectly consistent secondary world, at least not for his children's enjoyment. It's not even a rule that he followed in his own published writing. In 1937, he made the self-deprecating remark, "I don't much approve of The Hobbit myself, preferring my own mythology to this rabble of Eddaic named dwarves of the Volaspot and newfangled hobbits and golems invented in an idle hour in Anglo-Saxon ruins. Tolkien certainly valued consistency, but he did not have a rigid principle that all stories had to have a perfectly constructed secondary world, or else. Actions speak louder than words. For instance, one of the ways that we know that Tolkien appreciated Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet was that he made efforts to help Lewis get it published. With regard to Narnia, there is an intriguing indication that Tolkien had a generally positive attitude toward The Lion, despite not personally enjoying it. Around the time that Lewis was drafting The Lion, Tolkien's book Farmer Giles of Ham was in production. Tolkien was delighted with the illustrations produced by Pauline Baynes, which he received in the spring of 1949. He showed them to his friends, including, as we now know, to Lewis. In the expanded letters, we have a letter from Tolkien to Baynes in December of 1949, in which he says, "I hear from my friend C.S. Lewis, who saw the original and unreduced drawings, that he has got in touch with you." It's a small but significant comment, because the reason that Lewis had contacted Baynes was to arrange for her to illustrate The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. How did Tolkien know that Lewis got in touch with Baynes about the Narnia illustrations? This letter shows that Lewis told him directly. Far from being devastated by Tolkien's condemnation of Narnia, Lewis is keeping Tolkien in the loop regarding the progress of The Lion towards publication, just as Tolkien is keeping him informed about Farmer Giles. Rather than being jealous or irritated by Lewis's Narnia story, which has progressed so rapidly from draft to publication, Tolkien talks about it with Lewis and matter-of-factly brings this up in a correspondence with his illustrator. But a more substantial piece of evidence is that we know for a fact that Tolkien considered the Narnia books to be suitable reading for his grandchildren. His daughter Joanna recalled, when staying with Granny and Grandfather at 99 Holywell and later at Samfield Road, I was handed from his bookshelf the Narnia books, C.S. Lewis, The Borrowers, Mary Norton, and Andrew Lang fairy stories. The fact that he directed me to reading these other books before The Lord of the Rings is perhaps an indication of his humility. We now also have another piece of supporting evidence. In June of this year, Tolkien's grandson Michael George gave a lecture at Oxford. My friend and colleague Michael Ward spoke with him afterwards and shared with me what he learned. Michael George Tolkien said that although he never met C.S. Lewis, he did own a copy of the Chronicles of Narnia that Lewis had signed for him in Red Bureau. I think it's not unlikely that his grandfather Tolkien had secured a signed copy for his grandson. Tolkien was attentive to and involved with his grandchildren's reading. It's very significant that he kept the Narnia books on hand in his home for them to read. He even directed his granddaughter to prioritize Narnia over his own Lord of the Rings. He didn't personally care for the Chronicles, but he evidently saw their value for their intended audience, children. The only reference to Narnia in the published letters comes in 1964. Tolkien wrote that it is sad that Narnia and all that part of C.S. Lewis's work should remain outside the range of my sympathy, as much of my work was outside his. This is not a condemnation of the books, but rather a realistic registering of his own tastes and of Lewis's. Because I don't think, for instance, there's much indication that Lewis was interested in Tolkien's work in Elvish linguistics, as important as that was to Tolkien. And it's significant that Tolkien found it sad that he doesn't care for Narnia. He doesn't take that tone with other writers whose work he disliked. And presumably, he's sad because he would like to enjoy them, the way I feel about mushrooms. So he and Lewis had many similar tastes and interests, but they were very different men, each with his own creative vision. We should allow them that breathing room. What was probably Tolkien's last word on the subject of Narnia comes in 1971, just 2 years before his death, in a letter to his friend Eileen Elgar. I am glad that you have discovered Narnia. These stories are deservedly very popular, but since you ask if I like them, I am afraid the answer is no, I do not like them. I do not like allegory, and least of all religious allegory of that kind, but that is a difference of taste, which we both recognize and did not interfere with our friendship. I am glad that you have discovered Narnia. These stories are deservedly very popular. It may have taken Tolkien some time to appreciate their value, but he did. He still does not like them. But he is clear that this is a difference of taste, preference, not a judgment of value, and he explicitly states that it did not interfere with their friendship. The attitude that he expresses in this letter is not an exception. It is consistent with what we have seen in the evidence of the timeline and with Tolkien's actions. It is worth knowing what Tolkien really thought about Narnia without exaggeration and in proper context. It matters. First, it provides chronological context. We mustn't project our present awareness of Narnia's literary significance backwards, thereby placing undue interpretive weight on Tolkien's initial limited encounter with the lion. Second, it provides literary context. Tolkien read a great deal and had strong views about what he read. The Narnia books are not a special case. Considering Tolkien's reaction to Narnia and to similar books helps us to understand his views on literature and his creative methodology. Third, it reminds us to bear in mind the difference between literary judgment and personal taste. It is not an obligation to like Narnia, not even, dare I say it, at a C.S. Lewis conference. However, anyone who doesn't find them to their taste should emulate Tolkien in recognizing Narnia's objective merits. Lastly, and I think most importantly, it helps to correct what I view as a major injustice to the legacy of both Lewis and Tolkien, the idea that their friendship came to a bad end and that this breakup was caused by pettiness and jealousy about Narnia. To be sure, their close friendship became more distant in the last years of Lewis's life, but there were legitimate reasons why they drifted apart. If we are not misled by false ideas about Tolkien's views on Narnia, we are much better equipped to take a clear look at those last few years of their friendship and to discover the very good news that there was no breach, that they did not become frenemies, and that they were, in fact, starting to reconnect before Lewis's all-too-early death at the age of only 64. I, for one, find it heartening to know that the real story is one of two great men, great friends, who were able to have a mature and thoughtful relationship that could handle disagreements about what they liked and what they wrote. Maybe that's not as dramatic a story as Narnia versus Middle-earth, but I think the real thing is much more satisfying. Thank you. Thank you.
Every time Dr. Ordway reads the Carpenter biographies, I like them less. Tolkien didn't read modern literature. Yes, he did. Tolkien didn't spend time with women. Yes, he did. Tolkien disliked the Narnia Chronicles. Hold on. Questions?
Thank you, Professor Ordway. I've often wondered, given specifically that it's the first two chapters that Tolkien originally disliked, whether this might not also have something to do with the mode by which the children are going into Narnia, because we know, of course, that they discussed what is the proper or most effective mode of getting what we call real life characters into these fantasy situations. They talked about this with E.R. Edison. Is it a dream format? And Tolkien references this in On Fairy Stories. It seems clear that that's not his only objection, but I wonder your perspective on whether that might not also have played in, whether it's actually the wardrobe itself and the fact that he frames it not as a fantasy story on its own, but that it's a normal children transported into this world. What is your opinion on that?
I think we don't have any detailed evidence about what he thought in that regard, but this is an excellent question, Austin, because it frames it in the context of his other reading, and I think that's really important. How did he think about other literary works? And he had, I think, some reservations about how well that worked artistically, and whether that works specifically for fantasy. And he does talk about this in On Fairy Stories, that it's complicated. Now, I think when he talks about the dream vision frame in On Fairy Stories, it is important to note that he's not denigrating it. He's saying that it doesn't work for the particular kind of fantasy that he's analyzing, and he sets it aside as a different kind of thing. So I don't think we can take his comments on Fairy Stories as saying that he disapproves of the dream vision structure. But I think we have evidence from other things that he read and commented on that he's not sure how well it necessarily works. But, for instance, we saw he liked very much Edith Nesbit's stories, and there's some sort of time travel, for instance, with an amulet, and that's a kind of frame story. You have the current world, and then you have the past, and he loved that. So I don't think we can draw any clear conclusions. I think it is not unlikely that he would have sort of wondered if Lewis would make it work, but I don't think we can draw any conclusions about his reaction from that.
Holly, that was magnificent. And I want to just say, perhaps on behalf of the room, that you have in fact corrected a great injustice. And what you've also done for us is give us an exemplar of what an excellent scholar does. Thank you.
Folks, that was Diana Glyer who said that. Diana Glyer said that. And her book, The Company They Keep, was a major inspiration for my work, and especially for Tolkien's modern reading, and her clear-eyed look at Carpenter's statements about did the Inklings really have no influence on each other? And Diana said, "Here, let me write the book on that." So this is thank you. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kat Coffin. I'm over here. Thanks, Dr. Ordway. Thank you again for a really engaging, enthralling talk. And I might be getting this wrong because brain is completely full, very excited. Of the timeline, I thought I'd heard mentioned that the first two chapters, Lewis hadn't thought of Aslan yet. Like Aslan hadn't entered the picture. He just had those two pictures. Was that the copy, do you think, that Tolkien read with no Aslan whatsoever?
This is a very good question. It is not precisely laid out, but the way that I understand Green's account of Lewis's account of the creation of the first bits of Narnia, that originally Lewis was mulling over the story, couldn't get anywhere with it. Then he thinks of Aslan, then he's able to conceive the whole story, then he begins writing it, and that produces those first two chapters. So as I read the limited evidence that we have, and again, it is limited evidence, this is at least secondhand rather than thirdhand. Woo! I think that Aslan had been conceptualized at that point, but he'd only written the first couple chapters of the story now that Aslan has got it going. Yeah. But that's a great question, because these are the kinds of things we need to ask rather than sort of assume that we know the chronology.
Wonderful. Thank you again for chasing down that game of telephone.
So I have a comment, and Kimball Ferris, an attorney, I want to thank you for fulfilling an obvious longing that the audience has for a careful and instructive analysis of what the facts are, and not opinion built upon opinion, that becomes commonly held truth. And I want to make, and I especially like your focus on the misuse of pronouns where there is an it. And there's miscommunication about what the it is, because we don't know what it is unless we have a clear sense of, is it the first 2 chapters? Is it all 7 books? It all depends, doesn't it? But the real comment I want to make, and thank you for, is giving us an example, and this may be somewhat provocative, but how we can use this same careful analytic process in the political realm. As we are faced with opinion built on opinion, and I think we need to carefully reach behind all of that to do our own analysis of what the facts are. It was a wonderful presentation, well organized, well presented, A+.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Justin Keena. I'd like to present you with one useful thing about the A.N. Wilson biography. You mentioned he didn't have a footnote for the passage you selected, but there is one letter from Lewis to Tolkien that does not appear in Hooper's collected letters, and it confirms part of what you were saying about how it didn't affect their friendship and that they were both mutually aware that Tolkien did not enjoy Narnia. Specifically, the context of the letter has to do with how Lewis was asked to write an endorsement for The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, but he declined to do it and explained to Tolkien why, given that he thought his name would deter some readers. He said what he said specifically is it might do the book some harm, and in fact, his blurb for The Lord of the Rings had been attacked in the press. But you can see he still wants to help him out and doesn't want to damage the book's reputation. But he has this little aside. He says, "The public, little dreaming how much you dislike my work, bless you, regard us as a sort of firm and would only laugh at what would seem to them mutual back-scratching." But I think that confirms your sense of, at least here's another contemporaneous witness, obviously Lewis himself firsthand, saying, you don't like my work. That would include Narnia. This is the letter is in 1962, so he had finished the Narnia series by then. My question is a bit more specific, though. Do you think that title in the Tolkien's critique of Lewis's work in the first 2 chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Love Life of a Faun, do you think that could be possible, that he had really written that title in and then took it out because Tolkien critiqued it? Or
that's a really good question. And in fact, I'm pretty sure I did this in Tolkien's Modern Reading. That is actually the assertion that I made, that perhaps the speculation that I made, that since it doesn't appear in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it is possible that based on that criticism that Lewis edited it out. And that is a possibility because we don't have the drafts. However, I've been talking this over with Michael Ward, and if there is anybody who knows more about the way Lewis thought, I don't know who it is. And in those conversations with Michael, he convinced me that it was really very unlikely that Lewis would put in that kind of sort of innuendo in a children's book. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, yeah, that doesn't fit. Lewis wouldn't have done that. But that kind of exaggeration is absolutely Tolkien. I mean, it is Tolkien to a T. So it's not really the kind of thing that Lewis would do when I thought about it. But the exaggeration for effect is absolutely how Tolkien rolled. And I find that now to be still an interpretation, but I find it to be the more plausible and convincing interpretation. But by the way, thank you for that bit about the Lewis letter in the Wilson biography. Again, looking at the chronology is so important because here we have it in 1962, after their friendship has supposedly been devastated by his apoplectic reaction to Narnia. Never mind, of course, that Tolkien moved heaven and earth to get Lewis the Cambridge job. Yeah. So this is very helpful. Yeah.
I think there's a popular association of Roger Lancelyn Green and George Sayer with Lewis, probably because they both wrote biographies of him. But could you say a little bit about their association with Tolkien?
Yes, thanks, Hal. Yes, biographical context, it's really helpful. So Roger Lancelot Green is, I think, he is a very useful reporter because he not only was friends with Lewis, but he was in fact Tolkien's student. He did a degree at Oxford, and Tolkien read his thesis and gave him extensive comments on it. And Green's thesis was on the fairy tales of Andrew Lang. So it's in the context of many conversations about fantasy and Tolkien's preferences and his views and how it works. This is not a one-off comment that Tolkien makes to Green. They've been talking about these things. They have a context. And that's one of the reasons why I find Green to be such a reliable reporter, because they were in fact talking about these things. He had the context to say it. Sayre, he's a younger friend of them. Sayre was friends with Tolkien. Tolkien stayed at Sayre's house various times. I find that Sayre wasn't quite on Tolkien's wavelength. For instance, Sayre says some very inaccurate things about Tolkien's views about Vatican II. So, for instance, Sayre quotes a letter from Tolkien in which Tolkien's complaining about a bad mass and sloppy handling of the liturgy, and Sayre uses that as evidence for his assertion that Tolkien just hated all the reforms of liturgy after Vatican II. There's only one problem, and that is that the letter that Sayre is quoting was written before Vatican II. So I think that Sayre, he had a tendency to get a sort of impression in his mind that was shaped by other factors, and then he wasn't terribly careful about the evidence. So there are some things I think we can glean from Sayre that are helpful. For instance, I do think that it's accurate, very likely accurate, his recollection of Tolkien's conversation with Lewis about the mixing and how he says, well, it just doesn't work for me in the same world. Because that's specific, it's detailed, it has the flavor of an actual recollected conversation. And notably, it doesn't have the overheated tone. It sounds to me like he's remembering an actual conversation, but then when he tries to interpret it, he doesn't remember, and so he puts it in a context that overheats it. So I just think Sayre is a biographical source whom we need to handle with some care, I think.
What did Tolkien really think about Narnia? When we were thinking of who could take a stab at this question, who knows both Lewis and Tolkien, we thought of Dr. Ordway, perhaps. And I feel timid about saying this at a Quaker pacifist university, but I think we could all agree that was a murder